there are lots of things that we can do to push the envelope when it comes to our expectations for what election day can be, especially on a college campus. So this is about just creating that ideal day. And we, part of the thinking that goes into this is that we spend a lot of time in class, and that's great. That's what we go to school for, in large part, what we go to college for. But that there's this one day where maybe the classroom isn't the best place to be, and we think that's election day. So here's just a short overview of what we'll be covering. We'll talk a little bit about what this idea is and how it got started, the problem that it seeks to solve, and also how it functions as the solution. And that's where a map, for instance, will come in. So the day, as we tend to call it for short, came about shortly after the mass shooting in Parkland at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in 2018. And several of my friends and I have gone to the March for Our Lives in DC, and we were talking about it after, and there was this thinking that, like, my goodness, the activism that we're seeing before us today is so incredibly powerful, but how do we sustain it, right? What does it look like to actually have political power for a whole generation of young people? And we started thinking, and we looked at, the youth voting rates, and they've gotten much better, as I'm sure you know, but at the time they were nothing to write home about, and there are still concerns in various areas. And so then we got thinking about that. Well, why aren't we voting? And there's actually pretty compelling data. One of which surveys from 2016 that shows that 46% of students didn't vote in 2016 because they cited a lack of time or other schedule conflict on election day. Like 46% is a lot. And unfortunately, that has continued to, students and young people more broadly have continued to list that as a barrier to their political participation, most recently with a survey conducted by civic influencers. And so we see that there's this gap between the number of students that are registering to vote and then the actual turnout. So as you may reflect from your own experience, there's a lot of messaging around register to vote. Are you registered? Are you registered? But then there also needs to be the follow through of, all right, well, why might young people register but then not actually vote? And lack of time on election day consistently comes to the surface as one of those reasons why. So I attended the University of Mary Washington for undergraduate. It's a small to medium-sized public liberal arts school about an hour south of DC. And we pushed for this idea of, all right, well, let's see if we can cancel classes on election day in favor of something greater. And we took some work, but we were successful. And then after we got it through, there were students at other schools that started to reach out and say, like, hey, that's like, we're interested in that too. How did you do that? So then we sort of grew into this more national arena where we're trying to provide some infrastructure for students to do the same at other schools. That's not at all to say that we, own this idea by any means. There are newspaper articles from 2004 at the University of Minnesota, I believe, and the University of Virginia back in 2008 of students calling for the same thing. So this has been, I think, a constant ask from students in the civic engagement realm of higher education so far. And I think it's time we make good on it. So the idea is for essentially to, remove the barrier classes pose and replace it with this campus-wide celebration of democracy on election day. And depending on the school, that can take various forms. It could be more focused on service and volunteer opportunities. It could focus on education and talking about, well, hey, it's election day. Does this mean that we're actually going to know who the president, for instance, is by 10 p.m. on the East Coast? Well, no. There's a lot of education around democratic processes that we tend not to get from traditional channels, whether that's K through 12 civics education, or then even in college. And this day, at its highest level, is supposed to create space for democracy, so that depending on whatever your campus culture is, maybe you do focus on education, maybe you focus on service. You could tailor it to whatever makes the most sense to you. But it's to take time to focus on things that are happening outside of the classroom on that day. So we like to say, it's not a day off, it's very much a day on. It's just a day on something else, right? It's a day on community, it's a day on the polls, it's a day on democracy. And that's how we tend to approach it. Any questions so far? Don't want to just breeze through it, but okay. So why does this make sense? You know, we talked about some of the data regarding, you know, students citing this as citing classes as a barrier. But there are a couple of different reasons. The first is responsibility, and we tie that directly to the institution of higher education, whatever your school may be. I would be willing to bet that if you took a look at the school's mission statement, that there would be something in there about the existence of the school as a way to further good civic habits and behaviors. And so this idea is very much in line with the self-stated goals of higher education. And on that note, our colleges and universities, sometimes we think of them explicitly in economic terms, right? Like we're supposed to graduate economic agents that can contribute to the market and get jobs, but we're also supposed to be graduating students that are ready to engage in democracy. And sometimes that piece gets a little bit left out of the equation when you're so focused on career. But colleges and universities really do have that baseline responsibility. And again, it's often reflected in their very own mission statements. The second thing is habit. So I didn't include it here, but I'm happy to share later on if anyone's interested. But we do have research that shows your first civic experiences will have a lot of impact on the habits that you then end up developing. And the more positive we can make those experiences, the more likely that you are to become a lifetime civic agent. And if you think of a cornerstone of civic life as voting, well, a lot of times students are voting for the very first time once they get to college, right? You turn 18, that first election you're eligible for is likely to be your freshman or sophomore year of college if your state only has federal elections. So that lines up in a way that I think only deepens the responsibility aspect of it, because you're having these initial experiences while you're in college. And if we can make sure that they're positive, this day could go much further than once you graduate college. It could have implications on how you engage as a citizen for decades to come. And lastly, this is, not gonna lie, this can be really tough organizing work. I sort of think of it as organizing 2.0 campus, getting administration behind an idea like this. But the advantage of it is you're looking at a policy change, right? So if you take this on and you make this change at your school, you are changing things not only for you and your peers, but also for the generations of students to come, right? So a change in the academic calendar, if it becomes a permanent fixture, that would be it just extends far enough into the future beyond the time once you've graduated. So it can be tough going, but the impact there can also be really quite profound. And this last one is unfortunate, but since 2016, since 2020, we've seen early voting become really contentious at the state level. So we've seen state legislatures try to rescind early voting rights and practices, which means that in certain states, that only puts even more, not pressure, but it's limiting the options voters have down to, in some states, maybe just even election day. Or if they've got some really strict absentee balloting rules that sometimes students aren't in a position to take advantage of. So this can help bolster those restrictions by opening up election day itself in states where you're seeing a loss in early voting rights. But on that note, I will say, I think as I'm sure you're very well aware, the problems facing our democracy are deep and profound, and a big problem like the health of a democracy, in my view, requires big solutions too. So, I don't see this at all as an either or, that you just focus on election day. I'm absolutely for early voting, in part because then that opens up election day for other things like volunteering, helping others get to the polls, maybe serving as a poll worker, which takes the whole day, or attending multiple talks that focus on how to improve democratic engagement or study it or the like. So I don't see it as an either or. I think that, like climate change, for instance, there's really not going to be a silver bullet, and if the situation is so tough that you want to do as much good as you can. If you've got reason to believe that something will work, and we do with this, I'll show you a bit later on. I think you kind of throw as many darts at the dartboard that you think have a chance at nearing your target. So not an either or, super for early voting, and this sort of just exists as another potential solution, because again, we've seen students ask for it so many times and clearly state that they need it. Challenges: there can be a lot of bureaucracy to getting this idea through. Our universities, the inner workings of them, they can move at glacial speeds. Actually, I take that back. Our glaciers are moving pretty fast these days, unfortunately, but you get the point, right? So there can be some slow, it can be some slow going there, but we've learned, we're happy to talk through any of the potential roadblocks with you, but oftentimes just this manifests as there being lots of offices to talk to, and sometimes they'll be like, no, you talk to them, and I'll be like, no, actually we talk to them, and so you kind of can get the runaround. And you may have people tell you, oh, well, we can't do this. We decide our academic calendar 3-5 years in advance. But COVID taught us that academic calendars can actually be a lot more malleable when they need to be. So honestly, I see a lot of this as who can make the better argument, and it's like a fun intellectual exercise. So when I say those first two challenges, I'm referring mostly to the like the persistence you'll have to have and the arguments that you'll have to make. But the last one can be real tough. And the research aspect refers, we haven't had a lot of schools do this so far. So we don't yet know if this works, right? We have reason to believe that it does, but we can't know for sure yet because it hasn't been thoroughly studied. But also, if we don't have schools do it, we'll never know. So it's kind of the rock between a rock and a hard place thing, where administrators will often ask, well, how can we know? How can we know that this will be good? And we can point to all of the reasons why we believe it'll work, but we do need more case studies to reach robust conclusions. Okay. Opportunities, though, it does have a flip side. Again, I've said this, but this is really popular with students, and I'm sure you would know why. We worked with the University of Alabama this past year, and they came up with an innovative approach to put the question on a homecoming ballot. So they asked, are you in favor of class cancellation on election day? And they may have added additional things like how would you use that day? But that initial question, I think 98% of students said they would. And so that if you can organize and harness that desire for it, it's possible to make really compelling cases to administrators. And then the good news, additional good news there is, even though we don't yet have a lot of schools doing it, we have more and more by the month, it seems. So that is also good for the long-term future and for anyone wanting to push for it, say this fall. Now we'll get into a couple of findings, but first, just a couple. I'll share an assumption that I've made, and the assumption that I think you need to allow for the findings that follow is that some information is better than no information. So we do have some initial results, but again, I don't want to say that like there's a paper coming in an academic journal soon, because we're just not there yet for some of the reasons that I mentioned earlier. So we are still dealing with a few case studies, but here's what we do know. So the University of Marina Washington, we canceled classes for the first time in 2020, and so we just refer to this as our pilot school. And if you're familiar with ENSEL, this is the most recent report from Mary Washington. And so you see a nearly 13% increase in the voting rate here. I would note that this school tends to be fairly engaged already, but we did see that significant increase. And I can share the resource later on, but we sort of went all out at Mary Washington. We did, held programming on the day, made transportation available to students, held volunteer activities. A lot of students ended up serving as poll workers, faculty did too. So it was, we learned a whole bunch, and this was the first case. Wayne State University in Michigan, we worked with them also in 2020, and they got their cancellation through kind of late. I think it was early October of 2020, but this is their report as well. They also saw a 12% increase. And the students here were really quite excited to have gotten the day. I think they were particularly invested in it because it had happened that very semester. They got it passed, and then 2 weeks later they were able to benefit from it. So that's maybe something to consider there. Nina, your question, has Day on Democracy had success on local secondary schools? So I assume there you're asking like high school and below. Yeah, so we haven't ventured into we haven't ventured outside of higher ed yet, but that's definitely something to think about in the future, because there's, I don't know, that we're finding more and more just how important the K through 12 aspect of this is, right? So if we could get students before they get to college and get them excited about the idea, get them used to it too, so that if they get to college and they don't have it, they're like, well, what's up with this? So yeah, that's definitely a great question. And I see I missed a question from Allison earlier on. Can you share the sources for this data? Absolutely. So we'll, I can work with Jimena later on, and we'll figure out what the best method of doing that is, but we might get everyone's email if you're interested and just send out everything that that has been mentioned here. Also, all plants, I like that. Yeah, I like all plants too. University of Baltimore. Brittany. So now we're at George Mason, and George Mason is pretty close to Mary Washington, just for context, but they're vastly different institutions. George Mason, if you're not familiar, is very large in a city, and they also canceled classes in 2020 for the first time as a result of the governor of Virginia having signed a bill into law that made Election Day a state holiday. And since George Mason is a public institution, they just decided to get in line with the change in state policy. But they canceled classes and didn't do anything beyond that. And this is not at all to cast any shade on George Mason, just kind of presenting the facts as we've observed them. So there was no associated programming, nothing. It was just a blanket cancellation. And we didn't observe the same increase there. And in the interest of time, I've just included George Mason here, but we saw this at other schools as well, like Suffolk University in Massachusetts. So this begins to suggest that you can't just cancel classes, right? So canceling classes is necessary, but not sufficient. And lastly, we have Elon University in North Carolina. And Elon is a private liberal arts school, and they canceled for the first time in 2020. And we see like quite a big jump here. And they, like Mary Washington, have the works, right? So they've got a really, they had a really great campaign, Get Out the Vote campaign, very involved student voting advocates, real leaders on campus. And so we see this 25.2% increase. And again, not trying to draw any causal claims. And I'm sure you've probably heard in classes by now that correlation doesn't imply causation. And that's absolutely true, right? But that also, something that you don't often hear, but like you'll hear in a stats class and in grad school, is like, while that's very true, that correlation doesn't imply causation. If there is a causal relationship there, you will see a correlation, right? So if it ends up being that the two things are related and one is causing the other, you are going to see that correlational link between the two. So this is kind of just to wrap up that we're really starting to see that cancellation does have an impact, but you can't just cancel. You also have to have that programming component behind it. And that sort of leads us to, all right, well, where do we go now? And what does this really look like on the national level? And so there is a map that we've created to further contextualize things for you. And it's just available right at this link. And it provides a record of all ongoing, successful, and unsuccessful class cancellation efforts. It's basically like, here's everything that has happened, and you can then click on each individual school. Let me actually I'll just take us there, and then we can go through it. Okay, so can everyone see that? Awesome. So this just gives you a little bit of information about it. And thanks, Camilla, too, for dropping that link. And this is essentially the map. So it's color coded. As you can see, we've also made available the states that observe an election day holiday at the state level, because sometimes that means all of the public institutions in that state will then cancel on election day. But it isn't always the case, and that can be a really that can be an easy way in. If your state cancels but your public school doesn't, you can be like, well, hey, there's this disconnect here. So that can be a good way to start pushing for something like this. If you go to school in one of those states and you also go to a public school but it doesn't cancel. But this is a record of the schools that have pushed so far and how it's gone from every year available. And if you continue, yeah, there's some explanation here about what each label means. And then if you continue down, you can actually click on each school and get some information on what they've done so far. So like here we're at MIT, and you can go directly to like a primary source, something that students put out calling for it. And then here there's some local media coverage on it. And yeah, any school that you see on the map, if you're curious about it, you can then see it in further detail. Katie, don't think you can see the right slide. Are you meaning that like when I went to click on MIT, you didn't see anything?
Correct. I'm still on that first map, a record of like ongoing successful and unsuccessful class cancellation efforts. So I'm like one slide behind.
Okay, no, I totally, let me see. Does this change things? Okay.
Yeah. No, now I see something different. Thank you.
No, thank you for pointing that out. I got overly enthusiastic, which happens sometimes when I talk about this. So thank you for pointing that out. So this is, yeah, this is the page, and then this is the map. And what I was just talking about in purple, you can see the states that cancel on election day. And then there's this breakdown of what each of those colors means. So for instance, for us, we say that a day on democracy is institutional support for programming, which means like the school has stepped up and they've actually dedicated resources. It's not just student advocates trying to plan something for a whole school. That there's explicit intent that the day is going to be for civic and community engagement. It's not just classes canceled. And that you do so for every November election, not just federal elections, which is that last piece of stuff. And in some cases, we will just still designate the school as a day on democracy school, even if they got it just for federal elections, because it can be really difficult. But ideally, you know, our democracy is important every November, not just every 2 years. And even if there isn't anything on the ballot, there's always something to be learned about how we can better engage and participate and bring others along with us to do so. So ideally, we're canceling classes the first Tuesday in every November. And then, so here we go to any school that you see on the map. If you're more curious about it, let's go to an American university this time. And you see when they tried, when they were successful, and then anything we have on record for them. So oftentimes you'll see op-eds in student newspapers and those tend to be the first things that students put out. You'll also see SGA motions, and then hopefully you'll also see that final announcement saying that they were successful. So any questions on that so far? Open. Let's go back. And now that we've done sort of gone top to bottom, you might be thinking, all right, well, what do I do now? What comes next? And that's really up to you. Like I'm fully available as a resource if you want to learn more, and also if you maybe have already come to the conclusion of, I want to go ahead and see if I can get a couple friends together or fellow Vote Everywhere ambassadors and just make a go at this and see if we can make this happen. Then yes, like we can meet, and I'll be happy to walk you through what we've seen succeed at other schools and how other students have done it, and then maybe what might be unique to your school, what particular approach you might want to take to increase those chances of success. So on that note, there's a toolkit that we can share, and then again, if you want to look through any of the previous schools that have done that, you might also find that helpful. But I think other than that, we've reached the end. So thank you, and again, more than happy to take any questions. And thank you all also for indulging me on the plant portion of the program.